Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. John Danny is a research professor of Joint Interagency, Intergovernmental, and Multinational Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. He just wrote an article for Foreign Policy titled, "A drawdown of U.S. forces in Europe is all but certain." As this is a very hot topic, I wanted to know more about it. So why does John think a drawdown is basically certain? And what would it mean? And what does it have to do with the American nuclear deterrent in Europe and potential Russian plans? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. John, I want to talk about the main themes of your foreign policy article titled, "A drawdown of U.S. forces in Europe is all but certain." But first, can you please briefly guide us through the numbers and the main elements of the U.S. military presence in Europe?
Sure, Andre. Well, first, I should note that the views I'm going to express are mine alone and don't necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government or the U.S. Defense Department or the U.S. Army. The U.S. presence in Europe has been long-standing. First of all, we should note that the U.S. troops forward stationed, we say, in Europe. And by forward stationing, we mean they're not simply sent there for 6 or 9 months. They're there for a couple of years on a tour of duty, typically with dependents. We've had American troops in Europe really since the early years of the Cold War, since the 1950s. That followed a drawdown, of course, after World War II, but then we saw the rise of Soviet aggression in Europe and the Americans came back, so to speak. And at the height of that presence, we had maybe 400,000, between 400,000 and 500,000 U.S. troops across all services in Europe, forward stationed in Europe. That number took a nosedive right at the end of the Cold War, as you would expect. All the allies, not just the U.S., but all of the allies reduced their manpower, their military strength, and those allies that were forward stationed on the continent, the U.S., the U.K., the Canadians, you might even think of the French forward stationed in Germany, all those were drawn down over the course of the 1990s and into the 2000s. At the sort of the trough of this trend in about the 2013, 2014 timeframe, the U.S. presence was down to maybe 50,000 troops total across Europe, much smaller than what it once was. That rebounded, though, following Russia's first invasion. It began to rebound, I should say. And by the middle of the 2010s, the Americans were beginning to station, in small numbers, but were beginning to station more, not less, troops in Europe for the first time. Those additional troops came in the form of both forward station forces, that is units and troops that came for 3-year tours of duty with dependents, but also rotational forces. Typically, the rotational forces were sent to the east, that is east of Germany, into NATO's newest members. There was a reluctance at that time, that is the mid to late 2010s, to permanently forward station any Allied troops east of Germany, given the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act.
Why such a hesitation? It was already after the Russian annexation of Ukrainian Crimea.
That Founding Act required NATO to limit its permanent forward stationed forces in the East. Now, that phrase was never really defined, but most in the alliance claimed that at the time it was negotiating with the Russians, the thinking was that up to a brigade was not considered significant military forces. Okay, so anything up to that was viewed as okay under the terms of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. As we get into the early 2020s and specifically 2022, Russia's second, far more brutal, far more consequential, far larger invasion of Ukraine, that is where we really see an amplification of this trend toward increasing the presence of U.S. forces. So in 2021, we can say there were roughly 60,000 U.S. troops forward stationed in Europe. That number rises very quickly in the immediate aftermath of the war. The U.S. sends over forces on a rotational basis initially to the east, specifically Poland, but then dispersed across really 7 countries, including the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, I believe Slovakia as well. And so this increase in rotational presence is, of course, a reaction to what has unfolded on the part of Russia in Ukraine. And that's kind of where we find ourselves today. There's been a slight increase in the permanent forward station forces and in that same time period. And we also have seen an increase in almost a hybrid kind of stationing. And this is thinking specifically of the forward elements of U.S. Fifth Corps, which is now forward stationed in Poznan, Poland. During this pre-2014 period, what many NATO observers think of as the NATO 2.0 era, from the end of the Cold War to 2014, Fifth Corps, which had been forward stationed in Germany, was taken back to the U.S., back to Fort Knox. And it was viewed after the 2022 invasion by Russia of Ukraine that the U.S. needed this command and control capability that came with Fifth Corps, needed that to be in Europe. And so parts of it now are forward stationed in Poland, but it's rather unique. There are not dependents along with those forward stationed troops at this time. Now that may change. Those troops are there for longer than a 9-month typical rotation, but they are not there with dependents. So again, it's a kind of a hybrid model between what we think of or thought of as forward stationing and shorter, much shorter 9-month rotations. In any case, we are today at about 100,000 total U.S. troops across the continent.
So back to your article, John, I already mentioned, why do you think a drawdown of U.S. forces in Europe is all but certain? Because American President Donald Trump doesn't like European allies. And I will quote your article here. The Trump administration clearly views the European Union as an adversary. But it also must be said that polls vary, but we can say the majority of Europeans do not see Trump favorably, to put it mildly.
Yeah, this is a complicated situation. To be clear, and I tried to note this in the article. I think I did it twice in the article, although it doesn't come out in the title. I think a drawdown is a bad idea. I think any reduction of U.S. forces in Europe at this time, while there's a war raging in Ukraine, is a very, very bad idea. It sends the wrong message to Putin. It undermines our allies' ability to defend their interests and ours. And I think in the long run, we will end up paying more for this drawdown than if we simply maintained our presence right now. Now, that said, I think the writing has been very clear on the wall that the Trump administration is intending to draw down the American conventional presence in Europe. And I say that based upon a couple of data points. The most prominent of them were a pair of speeches given by our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, in Brussels in early February, in which he said that the American government was not going to withdraw from NATO, but we're going to turn the lead for conventional defense in Europe over to the Europeans. Furthermore, there have been stories in the open press that have reflected an ongoing debate within the Pentagon about whether, where, and how to draw down U.S. forces. The number that I've seen in the press is a drawdown of 20,000. You can also look to the speech made by Vice President Vance at the Munich Security Conference. And then there are other data points as well, including the Project 2025 document that was written before the election. Many elements of that document, both in the international relations and defense and security realm, but also in domestic issues as well, have been acted upon by this administration. And then finally, if you look at a testimony of the third ranking official now in our Pentagon, Mr. Elbridge Colby, as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, during his confirmation hearing and in his prior writings, he's also made it clear that his view is that the U.S. should be shifting more of its military assets and resources away from Europe and other theaters to the Indo-Pacific to manage the challenge that is China and its aggressive approach in that region. So for all these reasons, it seems clear to me that a drawdown is coming. It seems inevitable. Again, I think it's a bad idea for U.S. strategy, especially while the war is raging. But this seems the obvious direction. Now, why is this the case? Well, there are a couple of reasons, and I speculate on these in the piece I wrote in Foreign Policy. Again, these are all based on the available evidence. The first one that I think makes the most sense from a strategic perspective, perhaps, especially if, again, you're in Mr. Colby's shoes, is that the China challenge is so significant that the U.S. military, the U.S. government cannot afford to manage both a challenge from Russia and a challenge from China at the same time. In the view of those who espouse this argument, the Europeans are capable, they've got the capacity, they've got the economy, the strength to do this, they've got the manpower. They should be capable of standing up to a Russia that is a fraction of their economy, that is riven with corruption, etc., while the Americans turn their attention to the Indo-Pacific. That argument has some strategic merit, but again, I think it fails in the face of the ongoing war in Ukraine right now. In any case, that could be one rationale, that we need to focus on China. Another rationale may be, as you mentioned, and as I hint at in my article, that the U.S. government is just bent on not decoupling, that's too strong of a word, but backing away from its commitments in Europe, backing away from its relationships with multilateral organizations, even those of which it is a part, like NATO, or the EU, of which it's not a part, obviously. That view that the EU in particular is no friend to the United States, I think is very strong in this administration. In fact, the president himself said a few weeks ago that the EU was created to screw the United States. Of course, that flies in the face of the available evidence, but that was his viewpoint and he expressed it very clearly. And I think given the way the U.S. government across the board has treated the EU in recent weeks, really since the inauguration, provides further evidence of that animosity or that antagonism, let's call it antagonism, of the U.S. government, this U.S. government, toward the EU. Similar attitude, I think, exists toward NATO in many ways. The president, of course, has said he supports Article 5. The SecDef, Pete Hegseth, and our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, have both said the U.S. is going to stay in NATO. Our new ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, has said the same. So I don't think the U.S. government is going to withdraw from the alliance, but it seems very clear a backing away is in order, and or I shouldn't say is on the agenda. And that could be one of the motivations for this policy shift that, again, to me, seems inevitable.
So you mentioned a few things, but when we talk about potential drawdown, will these troops be more or less relocated to the Indo-Pacific due to the tensions with China also related to Taiwan, or will it be perhaps less straightforward?
I think, Andre, it really depends. If a drawdown is motivated by the need or the strategic logic to get more of our military assets into the Pacific, then yes, I could see some of the assets that we have forward stationed in Europe being very useful in an Indo-Pacific conflict. You can think of long-range fires that we have forward stationed in Europe, combat aircraft like F-35s or cargo aircraft. Those could be useful in the Indo-Pacific. Air and missile defense assets, including Patriot units or Aegis destroyers that we have based in Spain right now, for example. Those are assets that could be very useful in what we think of as a likely Indo-Pacific contingency or conflict. And the most obvious of those, of course, is a crisis involving an attempted Chinese takeover or Chinese aggression against Taiwan. But there are other assets that simply don't make sense in that scenario to have in the Pacific, and that wouldn't make sense to me, at least, and I think to many others, to shift out of Europe. I'm thinking specifically ground forces, such as armored units or mechanized infantry units. And these are the kind of units that I have great difficulty seeing as being necessary or helpful in a Taiwan contingency. Now, if those kinds of units are pulled out of Europe or removed from Eastern Europe and drawn back to Germany, for example, or Poland, the logic then of the drawdown is something other than shifting assets from Europe that we need into the Pacific. The logic then seems pretty clear that we are backing away from our commitments. We may be trying to punish Europeans in some way, or we're drawing down without a lot of strategic logic underpinning it.
You also mentioned in your article that you want to somehow identify the ways how the Pentagon can rebalance its approach to the European continent, but without sacrificing U.S. interests. Can you briefly tell us more about this?
My argument in the piece is that if the U.S. is going to draw down at all in Europe, and again, I don't recommend this. My assessment of the situation is a drawdown would incentivize further aggression by the Russians. If not today, then certainly in the future, and maybe in the immediate future. So again, I don't think this is a good idea. But if the administration, if the U.S. government is going to draw down in any way, it ought to do so in a way that maintains the American commitment on the ground in some conventional force categories. So again, I was mentioning earlier in our conversation the shift of possibly F-35s or cargo aircraft or Aegis destroyers. Now, these are all very useful. Don't get me wrong. These are all very useful if we get into some kind of a conflict with the Russians in Europe. But if we were to withdraw that plus our ground forces, all of our ground forces across Europe, or some big number of them, right, that would really undermine deterrence of the Russians as well as assurance of our allies. Moreover, there's a broader argument to be made about the extended nuclear deterrent. Myself and many other analysts believe that one cannot divorce the extended nuclear deterrent of the United States, that is our nuclear forces, from the conventional force deterrent on the ground. If there is a split, a cleaving of those from one another, that will fundamentally undermine the extended nuclear deterrent. Because now, in the event of a Russian aggression, let's say against one of the Baltic states, if American forces are not on the ground helping to defend those countries at their time of greatest need, and in essence, facing a risk of taking casualties, there are going to be great questions raised in the minds of those in Moscow, as well as people in Washington, decision makers on this side of the Atlantic, as well as among our European allies, over whether the United States is really prepared to, as the question goes, sacrifice New York for Tallinn. So again, this risk will arise if there is any kind of cleaving or drawing away of the nuclear deterrent from the conventional deterrent. So if the U.S. is going to draw down conventional forces in Europe, I argue it has got to maintain some degree of ground force presence in Europe. Ideally, both forward station forces, that is those we've had mostly in Western and Central Europe, as well as the rotational forces that we have arrayed all across Eastern Europe, but especially in the Baltics and Poland.
So, put it simply, having U.S. nuclear deterrent plus, I don't know, some special operational forces plus some logistics without a substantial number of ground forces wouldn't be enough from your perspective, right?
That's right. And that's not just my perspective. That's the view of many of those who study not just European security, but strategic stability more broadly and nuclear deterrence. My sense is that the American nuclear deterrent, the extended nuclear deterrent, that has strategic value, right? As a deterrent signal that we're going to defend our allies. But it is far weaker without the conventional deterrent married to it. And so that is the concern, that if you split those things apart, the nuclear deterrent itself becomes a far more risky proposition in terms of keeping the Russians or other aggressors at bay.
What do you think about this idea that Europe should deal with Russia basically alone? On one hand, there is a logic in it, I would say. I think we should really spend more money on defense and really we should build our capabilities and so on. But from what you are saying, you believe it probably won't be enough without the U.S. element. Why?
There are a couple of reasons why U.S. involvement is absolutely critical. My thinking on this, or my assessment of this, is really grounded in an assessment of what's in the American interest, right? what's in our vital interests. I completely agree that our European friends can do much more in terms of carrying the common responsibilities and the common burdens of defending our shared vital interests. And it seems to me the Europeans are heading in the right direction in that regard. And most of them have been since 2014, 2015, the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, when we saw a bottoming out of defense spending across Europe just before that, and an upswing ever since. Now that trend has been really on steroids since 2022. So I think that's heading in the right direction. My concern is, though, that Europeans currently lack the capacity for large-scale combat operations and the capabilities necessary to really perform as well as they need to against an adversary like Russia. And I'm thinking about capabilities such as long-range fires, hypersonic fires, air and missile defense are the kind of capabilities that Patriot provides. Aerial refueling, reconnaissance, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. These are all critical capabilities that are necessary in large-scale combat operations. Furthermore, you can think of the role that drones are playing in the current conflict in Ukraine. Our European allies simply don't have those capabilities and that capacity yet. So my sense is that in the short to medium term, over the next 5 years to 10 years at a minimum, the Americans have got to be involved in playing a key role in helping Europe to fill those critical capability and capacity gaps. Now, there's another key role that the Americans can play, really should play, even after our European allies have stepped up in the way that we are all hoping they continue to do. And that is in terms of leadership. You know, one of the benefits of being sort of far removed from Europe, yet being a member of NATO, is that the Americans can play a role on the continent and in the alliance of kind of an offshore, not an offshore balancer, but can play the role of this more objective party that has not been part, typically, of the historical rivalries within Europe, right? We can think of numerous manifestations of that rivalry. Anglo-French over the course of centuries, Franco-German, Franco-Polish, North-South. You know, there are many manifestations of this rivalries in Europe. The Americans coming from outside the continent can play a key role in sort of corralling all of these allies and almost pacifying a lot of these rivalries in a way that some other European country could not or might have a more difficult time in playing a similar role. And you could think of them, you know, who would these leaders to maybe step into American shoes be? The Germans, the Brits, the French, you know, the larger, more powerful countries in Europe. You can imagine for a variety of reasons why, you know, for example, let's just pick the French. If the French were the first among equals within NATO, that might cause some heartburn in Eastern Europe or elsewhere in the continent. Same might apply if Germany were in that role. And so, again, my point is that the Americans, even with the Europeans carrying their fair share or more than their fair share of the burden, which I think is our ultimate objective here, I think the Americans can and should still play an important, if not the leading role in leading NATO. And the reason for that, why would the Americans seek to do that? You know, stability and security in the European continent is in our vital interest. Our economy, our way of life utterly depends upon it. So I think for that reason, the U.S. ought to stay first among equals in NATO.
Can you imagine the scenario when the number of American soldiers in Europe will actually increase? A war with Russia?
Andre, I think anything is possible. It seems reasonable to me that the American presence in Europe would increase in the event of a conflict, because of course that's what we saw not once, not twice, but 3 times in the 20th century. We sent troops over to Europe in World Wars I and II, and then throughout the Cold War, all in an effort to prevent the domination of the European landmass and its productive capacity by a single protectionist, aggressive, predatory, expansionist power. Now, obviously, the threats changed in each of those conflicts. They were different, but we went to war, 2 hot ones, 1 cold, 3 times over the course of 100 years in order to protect our interests in Europe. I would assume that if Russia were to invade a NATO ally, continue its aggression beyond Ukraine, that we Americans would eventually be compelled to go and defend our interests in Europe once again.
But John, I don't want to, but I have to ask this. Do you think Trump would defend European allies in the event of an attack?
Donald Trump has said he supports Article 5, and I think he understands what Article 5 entails. It's impossible to predict the future, but I can tell you the vast majority of Americans support NATO. Public polling, even to this day, continues to support that. In fact, the latest polling I have seen from the Chicago Council, for example, or from Pew, both very reputable polling organizations in my country, indicate that American support for NATO is actually higher today than it was 25, 30 years ago. We also see this reflected in our Congress. The vast majority of politicians in our Senate and our House, on the right and the left, support NATO. And so it seems to me that there would be incredible political pressure, both from the American public and from the U.S. Congress, for this administration or any administration to act in defense of our interests in Europe. Andre, I should be clear, I don't want to be too Pollyannish about this, and I hope that's not the takeaway by your audience here. But clearly, I think in the eyes of Europeans, frankly, in the eyes of many Americans, the U.S. has become a less reliable ally, including to our treaty allies in Europe, or especially to our treaty allies in Europe. And so these questions are serious ones, and they are rightfully, justifiably being asked on your side of the Atlantic as well as mine. And so that's why I am reluctant to say anything definitive, but yeah, I will remain hopeful.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.